Good morning and welcome to the 22nd meeting of the Public Audit and Post-Legislative Scrutiny Committee in 2019. Can I ask the public gallery to please switch off or turn to silent your devices? Item 1 is decision on taking business in private. Do members agree to take items 4, 5, 6 in private this morning? Thank you. Item number 2 is Post-Legislative Scrutiny, Freedom of Information Scotland Act 2002. I'd like to welcome our witnesses and thank them for coming to the committee meeting this morning. As members and witnesses will be aware, we are joined by Dr Ben Worthy by video link. To assist Dr Worthy, I'm going to ask MSPs and witnesses to briefly introduce themselves before we begin. So, I am Jenny Mara, I'm convener of this committee.
Liam Kerr, North East Scotland Region Representative and Deputy Convener of the committee.
Alec Neil, MSP for Airdrie and Shorts, and not a candidate for the Tory leadership in Scotland.
You mean not yet? Good morning, Anas Sarwar, Labour member for the Glasgow region.
Colin Beattie, MSP for Midlothian North and Musselburgh.
I'm Willie Coffey, SNP member for Kilmarnock and the Irvine Valley.
Hello, Bill Bowman, MSP for the North East of Scotland region.
Alistair Sloan, Solicitor, Inkster Solicitors.
Kevin Dunyan, Honorary Professor at the Centre for Freedom of Information, University of Dundee.
Karen McCullough, Lecturer in Law at the University of East Anglia. And apologies everyone, my voice has gone missing. Sorry.
And Colin Reid, Professor of Environmental Law at University of Dundee.
And Ben Worthy?
Yes, I'm Ben Worthy, Senior Lecturer in Politics at College, University of London.
Great, thank you all very much indeed. Now the evidence session will take place in this panel format, but I'd like to encourage discussion. So as usual, members will ask questions from witnesses, but witnesses can also respond or ask questions of each other. We still want to have some structure to the discussion, so please indicate to me or to the clerks if you'd like to contribute. And when you speak, your microphone will be automatically activated, so there's no need to press the button. Dr Worthy, if you could just raise your hand to indicate to me if you wish to speak, and I will bring you in. So, the committee paper suggests 4 themes for discussion, and I intend to structure the session around these themes. However, before we do so, I'd like to ask witnesses to briefly highlight the positive and negative impacts of the Act, just to kick us off. Dr Ben Worthy, can I ask you to start with that, please?
Yes, in terms of the positives, I'd say that the Scottish Freedom of Information Law has comparatively very high levels of public use. It has good rates of disclosure, around 75% of requests result in some form of openness. And crucially, it has very strong levels of public support and awareness. In terms of concerns, there's worries, of course, that it's been undermined to an extent by game playing at senior political levels. There is signs of some patchy compliance, particularly in terms of arm's length bodies, and a concern of lots of regimes around the world. There's less proactive disclosure than was hoped.
Okay, thank you. Professor Reid.
Yeah, just echo those comments and welcoming the beneficial effect that the FOI regime has had in Scotland in terms of transparency and so on. I've been working with colleagues Dr Jonathan Mendel and Dr Sean Whittaker on a project looking at use of the environmental information regulations, a separate regime there. And again, we find a generally overwhelmingly positive story, but obviously there are some details in the application that can be worked on and issues where some users of the system have problems. Some of these perhaps going back to different conceptions, different ideas about what the whole scheme's about.
Karen McCullough.
I would say it has been a welcome and positive development. It has provided a mechanism for increasing transparency and accountability. We've seen a few examples of that, whether it's in terms of finding out about school closures or about the provision of residential homes for people with disabilities. So it has been positive, but again, like my fellow contributors, I would say that it has fallen short in several respects. The first way in which it falls short is that it doesn't keep pace with changes in technology. So, for example, we should by this stage be routinely publishing disclosure logs, but it's not happening even though the technology exists to make this easy and cheap to do. And secondly, if we benchmark it against international normative standards, it falls short on 5 of the 6 standards. I'll end with a positive. It does meet the criteria of reasonable cost, so that's a positive, but it's falling short on the other standards. We could do more.
Thank you very much, Karen. Professor Dunyan.
Well, I'll start with the positives. I think that the legislation is functional, and that's a positive. And that I mean that it's not the best law in the world, but it's well implemented. I've acted as an advisor to many governments and commissioners around the world with much better laws, but which are quite frankly unachievable in their aspirations. Public awareness is high. We've tested that since the beginning of that coming into effect. It shot up almost immediately once the law came into effect and has remained high. And there have been very significant disclosures, and things we now take for granted just didn't happen before the Act came into effect. I see from Darren Fitzhenry's submission to this committee, he mentions, for example, food hygiene standards and the certificates that go with that. Before that came into effect, those things were never published. And nowadays we expect to find them in every cafeteria and outlet, and companies like Just Eat are under pressure to make sure that they only take their products from those who meet the highest standards. That was all unknown before the Act came into effect. It was regarded as commercially confidential. And there are many other examples I can give. On the downside, I think unfortunately we've moved into a kind of compliance culture, and therefore the decision-making process as to whether to release information and then to appeal to the Commissioner is much slower than would be expected of an informal process. And for example, therefore, it's quite commonplace for officials to say that they have 20 days to respond to requests and work to that timescale, and they comply with that. That's not what the law says. It says as soon as practically possible, and in any event, not later than 20 days. The second thing is it's quite stagnant. We simply have not extended the reach of FOI in the way that was expected in the law and is now expected in terms of how public services are delivered. The committee is looking at that. And the third, which has been again raised by the other witnesses to this committee, is the failure to record. The recovery of information is not held in a way which makes it easily accessible for FOI requests, and certainly there's no obligation to record information which the public might be interested in.
Much, Kevin. Alistair Sloan.
Yes, so the biggest positive is obviously the ability of the ordinary individual to go to some quite large public authorities and ask for information that interests them. That's obviously something to be welcomed. There are a number of downsides in terms of the legislation. One of the biggest ones is probably the way in which public services have changed in their delivery, and perhaps governments up until more recently being hesitant to use the Section 5 powers to extend. There's obviously been some legislative changes around there, and we're perhaps seeing a bit more now, but there still is probably some more work to be done there.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. I'd like to move to theme 1 now, which is the first part of this whole process, making a request for information. And I'd really like witnesses to give us their views, if you have any. You don't have to speak on every theme if you don't want to, on the process of making a request for information. And I would suggest perhaps around the whole process, whether it's fit for purpose, who uses it. Could more people use it or not? Is there more education required? Could it be made more consistent? That's something we heard on local authority level in our last session. Who would like to go first? Ben Worthy, and then Karen.
I was just going to speak to some of our research that we've been doing over the last few years on freedom information. It seems from what we know that the users of FOI in Scotland are similar to those in other regimes. That's a mixture of the public, businesses, NGOs and journalists. It's important to note that the largest user group is normally members of the public. But as I think the successive information commissioners in Scotland have pointed out, there is a kind of discrepancy. And in terms of who uses it, if you want to imagine the typical requester, they are male, middle-aged and white, and there's a discrepancy in terms of gender, in terms of who uses the law, and in terms of age. Most requests also go to local government. I think it's really important to remember in terms of resources, in terms of patterns, that freedom of information is primarily a local tool. We estimated about 80% of requests go to local government. And also when you're thinking about it, and here I suppose you can refer back to what Tony Blair famously said about the Act, a small number of requests attract a great deal of attention. And if I can quote Professor Dunyan, the real value of freedom of information is often in the pages of the local newspaper rather than the national newspaper.
Thank you very much. Dr. McCulloch.
I was going to say that I think the pattern of white, male, middle class, whatever, reflects the knowledge and understanding of the general public of all legislation. So Ben gave a quote in his submission that was less accessible and used by people with disabilities or people who are older. And I would say that's not unique or specific to freedom of information legislation. It's a part of how the population works. Those with educational disabilities find it difficult to find out about any law, never mind freedom of information. It means that we have to address as a broader societal problem. How do we make the public more aware of their rights, their laws? But I wouldn't say that knowledge of freedom of information is any worse than knowledge of other laws.
Helpful. I have Professor Reid first, and then I'll come to you. Oh no, are you okay? Okay, Professor Dunyan then, please.
Yeah, I looked at this in quite some detail and also looked at what the witnesses to the previous committee session said on this. I think there seem to be kind of two tracks we can go down here. One is a track which was perhaps suggested at the last committee meeting, which is of somehow formalising the process of making requests which might be of assistance to those who are unaware of how to do so. So the suggestion might be, for example, as in many other countries, you have a portal, you have a named person or a named address in a public authority that you could go through, and you know, I could argue that we should have, for example, named freedom of information officers in every authority. That's commonplace across the world. In fact, many countries require by legislation that there's a named freedom of information officer. That is somebody with the overall responsibility, not necessarily the person answering requests. And with my other hat as convener of the Standards Commission, of course, every public authority in Scotland has got a monitoring officer or a standards officer required by legislation. So I don't know why we don't have the same thing for FOI. However, and that can be done, and we could, for example, create lists which could be held by the Information Commissioner of contact points. And of course, the website, What Do They Know? They have about 24,000 authorities listed on their site with contact details, including Scottish authorities, which can be used to make requests. However, the purpose of the legislation, which is not quite unique but unusual, is that it was designed so that people did not have to know their rights. And so the idea that the people who understand the law are white, middle-class male, why is that? Because every information request is an FOI request in Scotland. You don't have to know your rights. The obligation lies upon the authority to recognise that they have an obligation to respond and to treat it within the confines of the legislation. And if we move away from that, my concern is going to be that there's going to be a great assistance to those who are white middle-class male and activists and journalists, and not the ordinary individual who just wants to ask a question about what's happening on their street or in their school and simply make a request to their school or to their local council. To force them to go down a portal or to a specific email address, I think would be contrary to the very expansive intentions which were discussed in great detail in the committee as we brought forward the legislation.
Okay, thank you. Alistair Sloan.
Yeah, I just want to echo the comments that Professor Dunyan made there, that the advantage of the way in which the legislation is drafted at the moment is you don't need to know that the FOI Act exists in order to make an FOI request. You can just write to a public authority by email or by whatever means that you want to ask for information, and the public authority is then under a duty and an obligation in law to deal with that as an FOI request, moving away to a system where you have to sit and fill in a form, I think could be detrimental to the rights of individuals, and I would caution against that.
Interesting. Okay, Colin Beattie.
There's a couple of areas I'd like to explore. One, very straightforward, is freedom of information, the Freedom of Information Act, compliant with the provisions on access to information under human rights legislation? Anyone like to comment on that?
Dr. McCulloch, did you allude to that earlier?
I'll start, and then everyone else will chip in, I would imagine. Okay, so if I can just have a second, what I would say is that the existence of a right to access to government information is increasingly recognised in national and international laws. At the international level, the existence of a right to access to information is frequently articulated in human rights documents. And the first convention on an access to information law, the Council of Europe Convention on Access to Official Documents, was made in 2009. It was adopted in 2009. So the Council of Europe Convention on Access to Official Documents from 2009 is the first binding international legal instrument that recognises a general right of access to official documents held by public authorities, and it lays down a right of access to those official documents, and limitations on this right are only permitted in order to protect certain interests such as national security, defence or privacy. But this is where it gets interesting. So the convention has been adopted, but the convention will not enter into force until it has been ratified by 10 states. And to date, it has been ratified by 9 states, and it has been signed by a further 8 states. The United Kingdom has not signed or ratified it yet. And I think that the United Kingdom should add this to its to-do list. And even if the United Kingdom, shall I say the Westminster Parliament, is all consumed by all things Brexit, that shouldn't stop the Scottish Parliament from giving consideration to how Scottish law could comply with this convention. So I think that the Scottish Government should take steps to ensure that the Freedom of Information law in Scotland complies with the requirement or matches the convention standards. Be ready, be in a position to say to the UK other governments, look, we're ready to sign and ratify this, let's move the discussion forward. So that's the international convention, but you also specifically asked about human rights convention or human rights laws. And when it comes to human rights laws, you find that there's a variety of different levels of laws. So you have the UN is an important body, and the UN Human Rights Committee in 2011 published a new general comment on Article 9 of the ICCPR, and in that it expressly acknowledged that Article 19 embraces a general right of access to information held by public bodies. And as for the European Convention on Human Rights...
Can I just say, if you could bring your remarks, just if you want to close briefly, then we'll...
So I would say if you look at the European Convention on Human Rights, you will see that there have been pronouncements saying that a general right of access to information is a good thing, but the jurisprudence of the court has been slow to actually decide that in judgments. So we have one judgment, I'll give you the name of it, it's a Hungary judgment, and it says that it really depends on whether there's a public interest in having this information. So to sum up, we are doing our best to be compliant with human rights considerations, but there's more work to be done.
Thank you.
Of information legislation is or isn't compliant?
It is compliant in the sense that we have a general right of access to information, but we need to make sure that we have those rights not just in spirit, but actually able to be accessed properly. And so there are procedural barriers and there are cost barriers in place. So it may look like it's compliant in theory, but is it in reality?
Do other members of the panel have a view? Or?
have to say, for all practical purposes, this is an area that we try to steer away from because, as Professor McCulloch has said, the actual interpretation of the right has not been heavily tested in courts, certainly not in this country and barely at all in Europe. It's been more prominent in discussions in Latin America, and particularly UNESCO did a lot of work based around Article 19, and that's what drove forward a lot of the legislation, and there have been court cases in Latin America, particularly in Chile. I know that the Campaign for Freedom of Information also prominently reflect that. To my mind, the opening right in our legislation is very clear, and it's about whether or not therefore any restrictions on that right are contrary to what would be expected. I don't think that they are. I don't think the idea that you have a right to information means that you can place no restrictions upon the cost or the nature of that information, and therefore there would always be exemptions which would be you'd be entitled to apply to it. The question therefore is whether or not those exemptions are either reasonable in themselves or are being unreasonably interpreted, and that's really the role that the Commissioner has to play. But I have to say a reference is therefore to the Act and not to the overarching Human Rights Convention.
Do any other members?
I'm just going to mention that in the environmental area, there's a specific requirements under the Aarhus Convention which are implemented through EU directive, which more or less does comply with those particular requirements.
Okay, thank you. Alex Neil.
I've got two questions, actually. The first one is in response to another committee of the Parliament. The Permanent Secretary has indicated that the Scottish Government archives information after a certain period of time. I think, if I'm quoting correctly, it's just after a year, and that the archived information isn't readily available. Surely any public organisation that archives information, even if it's over a 5 or a 10-year period, and there is a freedom of information request or an information request for that information, they are duty bound surely to go into the archives and release it. Is that right?
Kevin Dunyan.
Well, I would have thought so. There's no special argument to say because you've archived it, it's no longer accessible through the legislation. Archiving should be a good thing. Archiving should be the case that you've now looked at information after a year and decided whether to retain it or not. So in other words, you would dispose of information which is ephemeral or of no particular value. The archive, to the contrary, should be information which is still to be referred to and therefore useful. And therefore I can't understand why it would not be accessible through freedom of information. We're not talking about information here, for example, which would be covered by any restriction in terms of a timescale. That's a different matter altogether. If it's simply archived material taken off the day-to-day server but still accessible, then of course it would be covered by FOI law.
So are there any guidelines, or should there be any guidelines on what information is archivable and therefore retrievable, and what information is disposed of, never to be seen or heard of again?
Well, the legislation on public records, for example, was meant to do that. So every authority should have a records management plan, which they agree with the Keeper of the Records of Scotland, and that should actually set out, how long information would be retained before it was archived, when it was archived, and how it would be recovered, and any information which was particularly sensitive, which would not be accessible through the normal archival recovery procedures. That was a major discussion which came about in Scotland, going back, I think, to the very first investigation I carried out as an information commissioner, was about to demonstrate that information about looked after children, what existed and what didn't exist. And because of the paucity of information and the lack of consistency, that's why we came up with a public records management regime in Scotland. So that should be the first port of call for public authorities.
Okay, that's very clear. My second question is, very often when you put in an information request, you get the reply, this information isn't collated or centrally collected. So there's a distinction made between, for example, if you ask for a copy of a letter, it's very difficult to deny that because it's just a case of taking a photocopy and sending a copy of the letter. But if you're asking for information that needs to be collated or collected, what are your rights, and is this not used as an excuse you know, because they then say it would cost over £600 to collect the information. How do we improve on that, which I think is sometimes used as an excuse to get round the legislation?
Well, the £600 is actually still a fairly, given the £15 per hour calculation, is still a fairly generous amount of time to gather information. So it's a lot of hours which can be put to gathering information before you exceed the £600. The difficulty would be if, for example, you're being asked to create information that the authority did not hold. There's no right to have the authority to create information. If the information is held in a dispersed fashion across the authority's functions or across the authority's sites, then it comes within the scope of recovering that information, and if it can be done within the £600 period, then it's no excuse to say it's not centrally collated. You're entitled for that information to be gathered and provided to you. So it really comes down to, does information exist at all in relation to your request? Where is it? How onerous it would be to gather that information in? And would it fall within the chargeable regime, which would be, of course, £50 for up to £600. Beyond £600, of course, you're not entitled to get it.
Assuming it's within the £600, they're duty bound to supply the information, although you may need to have to collate it and analyse it yourself.
Two things. The analysis, of course, would be, yes, for you to do, but in terms of collating it, in other words, if, let's say, for example, the information is held locally in a number of health facilities around the health board area, the authority does not direct you to each one of those health board facilities. They have to gather in the information. They hold it as an authority, but it's simply in a dispersed fashion, and then present that to you in a list or in the format you want it. You may then want to analyse it further or interpret it. They don't have to do that for you, but the raw material that you've asked for should be made available to you by that process of collation.
Yes, I think this discussion highlights a sort of bigger issue that when looking at the operation of access to information, you can't separate that from how information is held, collected and used within an authority. One of the frustrations from users in relation to environmental information is the length of time it takes to get a response. But sometimes that's genuinely because within the authority, as has been described, the information's held in different places. It needs to be brought together. And the mindset, the way in which the user on the outside they see a problem that tends to be based on a particular location, a particular spot. Within the authority, they'll have information, but it's divided by functional and operational reasons. And there's something, a bit of a mismatch there that alters the public expectation sometimes doesn't appreciate the reality of the difficulties the authorities have in collecting the information, but equally maybe there are ways the authorities can hold, index, archive the information in a way that makes it easier to access.
Okay. Just to add to that point, I dealt with that in a case, I can't recall the exact case in Scotland, but the authority basically refused to add up. So in other words, the person said how many instances of whatever the thing they wanted. The authority actually held whatever it was, 50 cases in their systems. But because the request was for a composite number, their argument was they're not required to add up. I said that was quite clearly nonsensical. You know, if you can see you've got 50 cases, all individually numbered 1 to 49 to 50, then you have 50 cases. So the idea that you can only get information if the authority has already, for its own purposes, brought it together, I think is completely contrary to the spirit and the requirements of the legislation.
Professor Dunn, out of interest, do you find that the same rules are applied within organisations? I've got this example. I asked our own information service, SPICE, to collate for me the number of legislative provisions that have been passed by this Parliament that have never been enacted, and the precise answer about the £600 and too much time would be spent on that came back. But that, to me, was strange because it was a legislative answer to an internal question. Are you finding that organisations are actually using the scope of the legislation to block requests within an organisation, or is my request to them a legal freedom of information request?
It's a good point, and it does cause a lot of friction at times, because certainly with inside organisations there has been up until that time perhaps a collegiate exchange of requests and response, and the Act is never invoked or referred to, and then sometimes when the response is not one that the requester has expected, then they formalise it, and sometimes that causes resentment. I've seen that particularly with trade unions reps inside an organisation speaking to their personnel department, and then suddenly they formalise the request in a way that had been contrary to their previous exchanges. But yes, I think the very last decision I took as an information commissioner concerned a health board where a nurse asked for information regarding effectively near misses in terms of serious incidents which involved operative care and surgical care. And when they formalised that as an FOI request, the response from the authority was extremely negative, and indeed at one point they were told that they would treat the request as vexatious, and then suggested they might institute disciplinary proceedings against the employee if he continued with his request. It's quite, I refer to it because it's a very famous case.
No, it's interesting. On that specific point, is a request within an organisation, and clearly this is applicable across Scotland, big organisations like health boards or councils, is a request of an employee or somebody within an organisation, is that a legal freedom of information request, or do you need to be out with that body to exercise your legislative right?
Technically it is. Now, the obvious issue is that if you're sitting next to your colleague and you ping them something on an email, you don't expect to be exercising your FOI rights to them. However, if you are a relatively junior employee in the organisation and you're asking management for information, for example, which impacts upon the way in which you carry out your work, or how hours are actually allocated to work, that is an FOI request. And therefore there are many instances where people do ask for, in particular, how are procedures being applied. So we've seen this, for example, with universities, for instance, where academics have asked information of their own institution, and those are FOI requests.
Okay. It brings us on. I'd like to kind of draw theme one to a close. It is a big theme, but before we do, I think there's an important point for Professor Reid in terms of environmental information and FOISA. Are we at a point that these should be merged now, Professor Reid?
I think it is a bit confusing having the two regimes, and clearly having just the one system would simplify it, although in most cases it doesn't make any difference. It's often sometimes the user, the requester, who's confused. They make an FOI request, but actually it has to be responded to as an environmental request, and they don't quite understand why they're dealing with different things. In terms of merging the two systems together, it would obviously be easier. The constraint on that is that the environmental scheme, even if when we leave the EU and no longer have to comply with the detailed EU directive, we still have to comply with the requirements of the Aarhus Agreement on access to environmental information, and they are in some ways a bit different from the rules in the Freedom of Information Scotland Act, particularly in relation to some of the exemptions, some of the definitions, and so on. So there would have to be, if you were going to amalgamate the two, there would have to be a shift in the You can't put the environmental information rules into FOISA without falling foul of some aspects of the Aarhus Convention. So you'd have to shift the Freedom of Information Scotland Act, the general rules, a bit towards wider access in line with the Aarhus structure.
It sounds a bit as if it probably wouldn't be wise for the Parliament to tackle a merging of those two issues until Brexit's decided.
Certainly, well, until we know what's happening, we are bound to follow the EU directive, which is not just Aarhus, but a slightly stricter version of that. But once that directive disappears, we would then have more flexibility in what we do with the environmental side, as long as we still comply with Aarhus.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to ask Liam Kerr to introduce theme 2.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. So I'd actually like to lead on from Alex Neil's point in talking about how bodies respond to requests and their ability to respond to requests. Because, for example, Dr. Worthy, you and a number of others have highlighted the massive resource pressures which are in public bodies, particularly local authorities, which I think you said make up 80% of the requests that are coming in. We've had a number of representations suggesting that there should be a review of the cap that can be charged, the £600, in responding, particularly in relation to local authorities. Do any of you have any thoughts on that and in the resource concerns in general? Dr. Worthy.
I think this is a place where we need to have kind of careful conversations. The problem is that it's very hard to measure how much a freedom of information request costs. When we looked across different ways of calculating it across different regimes, for example, in the UK FOI Act, the UK government estimated it cost £193 per request, but a local council estimated it costed £19. So you can kind of take a figure and run with it with whichever figure you like. My other concern is that when you talk about the cost of FOI, you're talking about the cost of a democratic right, like the discussion about how expensive an election is. And also, you sometimes frame it in thinking about a particular way. I do believe that, you know, if local government, with all the resource cuts it's experienced, does need more help and support, but I think there is also a danger in talking about freedom of information as a burden, in inverted commas, which kind of plays to a certain argument against the law.
Thank you. Unless anyone else wants to come in, I'll move on then to come at it from a slightly different angle, which is that Professor Dunyan, you said earlier, or you talked about the timescales, and you pointed out that 20 days was like a limit. It was really, compliance should be as soon as reasonably practicable. And 20 days as a kind of long stop. But if the analysis that we've just talked about is right, then compliance is becoming ever more complex. And certainly the Scottish Courts and Tribunal Service talked about particularly complex requests and suggested that perhaps we should go to a 40-day compliance window. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Ben Worthy's laughing. Would you like to tell us why, Dr. Worthy?
So it's just the problem of an anchoring effect. Whichever number you put down, people will kind of work to that number automatically. So I think one of the dangers is like Professor Dunyan said, if people are working towards the 20 days, if you put it down 40 days, then people will work to that. I think when the UK government initially put together their law, they recommended something similar to that, and there was quite an outrage that the problem is that most requests would end up appearing on day 39 rather than towards the beginning. So I suppose that again, the danger is regimes around the world have very different time limits. Across Europe, it varies from kind of 5 days, 5 working days, and there are a few regimes that I think move towards 40 days. There's also some procedures, and Professor Dunyan will know better than this, whereby if it's an issue related to human rights, it has to be done within 2 days or so, I believe, in Mexico. So there's a huge variation, but I just fear the anchoring effect of the longer you extend it, the more people will work to the limit of that. In a way, it's sort of human nature.
Dr. McCulloch.
Add to that there are shorter time periods depending on the issue in other countries, as Ben has pointed out. And secondly, that information sometimes has a value within a particular time frame and it loses its currency after that time frame is passed. So if journalists are trying to report on something that's newsworthy and topical, 40 days in the newspaper world can mean that the whole political world has moved on. So it can be important to have timely responses.
Dr. McCulloch.
Well, yes.
Yes, indeed. Okay, thank you. Alistair Sloan.
Thank you, Convener. There's just one aspect I'd like to mention in respect of this timescales, and it's just a comparison with the UK Act and perhaps something that the committee and the Parliament wants to be aware of when it's considering this matter. Under the UK Act, there's 20 working days, as in Scotland, but that can be extended in certain circumstances, but there is no definitive legislative date by which this must be responded by if it's extended. So if the Parliament and the committee is minded to recommend that there is some form of change to the timescales, then I would suggest that ensuring that there is an absolute maximum statutory period of time in which a request can be responded to is important. I've certainly seen examples under the UK Act of requests taking 9, 10, 11, 12 months.
That's helpful. Colin Reid.
Just to say, there's an issue here about the developments of technology, that certainly the environmental rules were being made up at the end of last century when access to information meant getting a printed copy from the filing cabinet, somebody copying it, somebody posting it. Public expectations in terms of immediate access to information are changed hugely. So I think there's a deeper issue here, that the whole way in which information is kept, gathered, stored, distributed now is a bit out of step with when the legislation was first being thought about.
Professor Reid, let me put an example to you. I've got a business in my constituency that had an environmental request. After this is quote, after 14 days, I was advised that government departments, Scottish government departments, would require extra time to acquire the relevant information. This extension was another 28 working days. So the initial request commenced in September, but was not delivered for a long time afterwards. Virtually all the staff names, positions and email addresses were redacted. It was argued this was to protect the staff, but it made it very difficult to determine who was providing information to whom, and it was only because the same request was made to 3 different government departments and agencies that they were able to put the pieces of the jigsaw together to get the information they needed. Is this acceptable, and is this common?
I don't know how common it is. It doesn't sound like good practice. Without more details, very hard to comment. I think the authorities have an obligation to assist the requester, and sounds as if that may not have been the case there. But it may, there are also this issue about different information being held by different authorities, being divided up, and so on. Again, goes back to this wider issue about from the outside you see a single issue, but from the governmental side it may be divided up into a number of different chunks for good or bad reason.
Are authorities over willing to redact? Anyone?
I haven't studied the content of responses often enough. I think Kevin probably be in a better position.
Can I just go back to the first question to Professor Reid? So I think you mentioned that the information requested was environmental information?
Yes.
So that's a good example of what Ben Worthy's been talking about. The environmental information regulations, because of ARHUSA and the directive, do allow for additional time for what are described, however, in the regulations as particularly complex and voluminous requests for information. Now, it doesn't sound to me like that was particularly complex or voluminous, but who's going to test that until after the fact? So they're able to assert that it is and then take the extra 20 days. So in that case, you can take up to 40 days for environmental information in those circumstances. So the concern is always, unfortunately, about the potential for abuse by the authority, not abuse by the requester, but abuse by the authority in dealing with information requests. The second thing is that as Dr. McCulloch was saying, there are sometimes time constraints on the usefulness of information, and again, for environmental information regulations, the directive and the convention is about not just access to information, but also about public participation in decision making. In other words, it's got a purpose built into it, which is this information is intended to be useful in a democratic decision making process to allow the public to contribute. So, for example, for planning, and I do think, therefore, sometimes authorities push things to the limit so the information is less useful than it might be otherwise.
Thank you. Bill Bowman.
If I can ask Dr. Worthy a question. In your introduction, you used the phrase proactive disclosure. I just wondered what you meant by that and what seems to be more of a reactive process.
Well, it's important to remember that freedom information laws, when they're created, are supposed to do 2 things. You respond to requests, but you're also supposed to publish information proactively without a request that may be of interest to the public. And one of the problems, which Dr. McCulloch and others have been alluding to, is that these laws were created kind of in the mid to late 20th century. And the idea here was that these publication schemes, as they were called, would help drive this. The idea that there would be an index available so that people could see what information was available and would be published. And the difficulty is that the kind of proactive aspect has been sort of overlooked to an extent because of the focus on requests, but also we found in our research that these publication schemes don't work quite in the way that they used to, because now if people want to find some information from a public body, they just Google it. They don't go and scroll through a long list of documents, they just try and find it via Google. There is one link that we found in some of our research whereby we did an experiment with English parish councils where we made FOI requests to some of them and made an informal ask to others and asked if they'd also publish the information. So we did find that if we made a formal request, they were more likely to publish the information on their website, even though they weren't legally obliged to. So the two are linked, but our research pointed to the idea that the proactive side, because it's difficult to manage, is slightly outdated and not happening as much as it should.
To follow up on that, is that what Dr. McCulloch meant by disclosure logs?
Yeah, it's just basically publish a record of any request you've received, because quite often people Google looking for the same answer over and over again, and they have to keep submitting the same requests. If you just publish what you've already disclosed somewhere else, it cuts down a lot of the interaction, speeds the whole things up, keeps everyone happy, and it's easy to do because the internet exists, technology exists.
Mr. Bowman, we've moved into theme 3 with your question, so I'm going to bring Mr. Sarwar in a minute after Professor Reid.
To say that another of the legal differences between the FOISA regime and the environmental regime is a greater obligation under the environmental regime towards proactive disclosure, but because of the dominance of the general freedom of information stuff as an area of research, work, study, priority, it tends to get diminished. People still tend to think about the environmental information regime as being a reactive one, although the proactive side should be important and genuinely is. I mean, the authorities do publish a lot of information.
Thank you. Dr. McCulloch and Professor Reid have kind of covered this some of this in terms of proactive publication. Can I take you back just a step to that before the proactive publication? Do you think there has been, FOI was all meant to be about opening transparency, greater accountability. Do you think there's a risk that the culture has changed in terms of maybe people now not recording information they previously did record so they can avoid FOI legislation?
Can I answer that?
Yes.
The risk is always there. I think it's actually got greater in some respects. So in terms of the preparedness to be candid in your advice that you give, for example, from an official to a minister or between ministers, certainly when I was looking at documents within the confines of an FOI request, I didn't see any reduction in the candour and the professionalism of the advice being given to ministers. The areas which people were more concerned about were, of course, the informal email exchanges which led up to that official advice coming out, but often that was protected by the exemptions in the legislation in terms of formulation of policy and so on. To be frank, the area that I am now concerned with is the temptation, first of all, to have actual avoidance, and I see that there have been some submissions on this, but when I was a commissioner, I did come across an authority where they actively went out their way to instruct their staff not to write anything down, to verbally brief their colleagues if they came back from a meeting, for example, and to remove all their diary entries once their expenses claims had been submitted. And that quite clearly was intended to frustrate freedom of information. So some of that gaming of the system will go on. And then the third area, of course, is now the ability to exchange information and not using the official channels, and so using private email addresses, WhatsApp, and others. Now, that has always gone on with the advent of BlackBerries, but the intention was that that information would still then be copied into the official systems thereafter. But it's quite clear that there have been instances where that's not happened, and if I'm allowed to refer to what's quite clear in the public domain, was obviously the exchange between Michael Gove when he was Education Minister and Dominic Cummings when he was the Special Advisor. Now, that was referred to by Severin Carrell in one of your earlier sessions, and Severin got that actually wrong because he said that therefore this information was not accessible. Well, in that case, Severn misremembered what actually happened subsequent to that Financial Times report, because information commissioners in England, my counterpart at the time, Christopher Graham, I myself here in Scotland, quite clearly said that it didn't matter the portmanteau through which the information was exchanged, whether it was through the official channels or in your Hotmail account or in a Tesco bag. The information still remained official information if it was on official business, and therefore was still FOIable, and commissioners would have the right, for example, to inspect any device which held that information, and that's quite clearly the case.
Professor Dunyan, on that point, are you saying that, say, email exchanges between special advisors or text messages on personal phones all fall under the gambit of FOI?
They do if they're about the official business for which they're employed. And that's quite clear from the decision which goes back quite some time now, back to when that incident happened. It's quite clear in the guidance that if you go onto the Information Commissioner's website in Scotland and in the UK, that's quite clear. And warnings are given that therefore if they, and this is what's extremely important, is that if an FOI request comes in and you don't disclose the fact that you hold that information on that device, you are in danger of being prosecuted for obstructing the release of information, which is you could be prosecuted and have a fine of £5,000.
Were to be believed that official information had been exchanged on private, personal email texts, you're saying that the people exchanging that information would be legally obliged to disclose it under FOI?
Yes, they are.
Okay.
It's quite clear. And I think, and my concern therefore is that this is not being readily understood, and people are endangering themselves by thinking that they're actually getting around the law by doing that.
If a request goes in for an FOI, and the officer that's dealing with the FOI goes to the relevant ministers or special advisors to request information, but isn't proactively told that communications took place on private servers and therefore denies that information, are you saying that they're proactively breaking the law?
I am, because it's quite clear that they are therefore obstructing the release of that information that they know they hold and is within the scope of the request. And Section 65 of the Act in Scotland sets it out quite clearly that it's not just simply destroying or defacing the information. By obstructing its release is actually an offence under our legislation and is actionable. And indeed, when I was the Commissioner, there was an instance where I found that information had not been provided in response to requests and had been deliberately taken off the system by the authority concerned. This is not to do with a private mobile at that time. And it's because of that case that we actually had in Scotland a change in the legislation which meant the prosecution could take place sometime after the offence having been committed, because it's so difficult to establish it had happened.
On that basis, Professor Dunyan, undoubtedly there will have been private emails used or text messages used to communicate government business. Undoubtedly.
Yes.
To what the scale of it is or isn't is irrelevant for the moment, but undoubtedly would happen. Have you ever seen an FOI response that included communications on a private server, private email, text message or WhatsApp?
Well, I don't think WhatsApp existed when I was Information Commissioner, so not that.
Or even publication since. Have you ever seen it?
No, and of course that's why Dominic Grieve, when he stood up in Parliament 4 weeks ago, actually asked that question and was knocked back interestingly by Michael Gove in his new capacity and by Geoffrey Cox, Attorney General. But I think, again, they were both wrong. They said, who would be this person who could actually inspect the devices? Well, the answer is the Information Commissioner has the power to do so. It's quite clear in the legislation that they have. It's not something, however, that a Commissioner would do lightly. I have asked questions of senior civil servants and ministers directly, is there any other information within the scope of this request? But I would not ask them to hand over their mobile phone to prove it. I think there would have to be some evidence from a third party before I would do so.
Ben Worthy is desperate to come in on this point. Is that right, Dr. Worthy?
Yeah, I was just going to add exactly to what Professor Dunyan said. Just talk a little bit about our attempts to bottom this out in our research in freedom information in the UK Freedom Information Act and in English local government. And our conclusions were sort of twofold. One was that at an official day-to-day level, this kind of chilling effect, as it's called, is actually quite rare. And we find that officials were more concerned about the results of not having a record if a judge came knocking. And we even found, and other researchers supported this, that actually the arrival of freedom information can sometimes have a professionalising effect. And I mean that in a positive way on how people went about keeping records. The second area, and the area that's a bit more mysterious, as Kevin alluded to, is about the higher politics. And we found in 2018, of course, there was the intervention from the Scottish Information Commissioner in Scotland. At the same time, the head of the civil service in Northern Ireland spoke of how some senior political meetings were not minuted anymore. And there was this creeping sense that there was some avoidance. This can be done through use of private communications, or even, if I dare bring it up, the reclassifying of information, what seems to have been happening according to some sources in the White House. So there are different ways around it. It sends a very negative signal and it undermines the law. And just to think about this in the round, what we see here is the fact that freedom of information is now interacting with all these other new forms of communication. And this is where it gets quite complicated. And Dr. McCullough talked about the arrival of new technology and how that affects openness laws. The only positive I can think of is that we are discussing these things in public. And politicians keep getting caught out because it almost inevitably leaks, or a whistleblower will point out that this has happened. But the scale of it, we're not really sure. So there's this twin track where we don't think it happens every day, but we do think, particularly in controversial senior levels, it can take place.
So clearly, you can see it's happening because of the political chaos in certain places. And when there's political chaos, politicians make life difficult for each other, and that obviously helps in terms of leaks. But when you have command and control government, it's a lot harder. So if we are accepting that undoubtedly, regardless of how much it happens, there will have been business done on private servers, whether it be private emails, text messages or WhatsApps by ministers or special advisors, and there will have been FOI requests in the past, and maybe even currently requests that are in, that would be relevant to private emails, text messages and WhatsApp messages. If they have never ever been seen in any FOI responses, then clearly special advisors and ministers have broken the law.
They have broken the law if they deny that they have information within the scope of the request and they know it exists in whatever form, whether it's sitting in their briefcase or sitting in their private Hotmail account. The case that we mentioned in terms of Michael Gove was because they inadvertently forwarded an email to somebody that they didn't intend to, and actually to a journalist, and therefore they outed themselves in that respect. There are clearly instances where information you would expect to exist doesn't exist. There have been some significant events in Scotland where when an information request was made, it was found there to be nothing within the scope of that request, which seemed implausible given the nature of the activity, whether it be legislative programmes or otherwise. But whether he can go as far as saying that, however, information does exist but it's been simply withheld or destroyed, I think that's a leap that I would not want to take without evidence.
Okay, I'm keen to wind this up, but Dr. Benworthy, you started speaking there and we couldn't hear you. Can you please repeat what you said briefly?
Sorry, there has been a few cases, but I don't know where they've got to. It was said that David Cameron and Nick Clegg, when they were Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister, used to communicate via text messages. And there was definitely some FOIs for their text messages. But I never saw that they were ever released. So it might be worth tracing a few of the high-profile requests like that to see where they got to.
Thank you. Willie Coffey.
Convener, it's really to ask about this other aspect of record keeping that Anna Sarwar introduced there. During previous meetings there was, I think, the expectation or complaint from people that minutes weren't taken and recorded and so on. And I think you said, Professor Dunyan, that there's no obligation under the Act to record information, no obligation. How do we square that with the issue that Anis raised there about the expectation that information is there somehow but isn't recorded? How do we kind of square that circle?
It's a hugely difficult one. I mean, I do speak to other people in the field about this. It's one thing to have a duty to provide information that exists. It's quite another to stipulate what information has to exist. Now, in some countries, more modern FOI laws, there is built within the confines of the statute a requirement to produce certain information. And therefore, of course, you have to record that information to produce it. So the equivalent of our publication scheme would be much more specified than, say, a country like in Croatia. It sets out in the face of the legislation what information must be made available. And so there's a bottom line as to what information should be recorded. But what I understood from the witnesses coming to your previous session was that they said, well, if you have a meeting between yourself and I don't know, a developer between a minister and a developer, or then you'd expect to see a record of that meeting. It's in the minister's diary, but there's no record of it. I understand that, but I think the question is always going to be, does therefore every contact have to be recorded to that extent? But perhaps, yes. Now, for example, with the requirements on lobbying, every contact by a lobbying body, which include an NGO, is meant to be noted in the purpose of that meeting. It would be useful to have at least some official record of, if only for the protection of the minister or the official, as to what the purpose of that meeting was and if there's any outcome from it. So I don't think we're expecting a formal meeting in terms of attendance and the minute being reviewed subsequently, but a note of the meeting would be helpful. But to codify that into a law, I think we're all finding it very difficult to say, well, where do we actually draw that from? And, you know, I have spoken to other professionals in the field, and to be honest, most of them are shying away from that obligation being placed upon them. Not least, I think the information commissioners are not keen to be given that obligation to institute a duty to record.
That's kind of taken us into this wider territory about what information actually is. What is it? You know, because we've never really thought about what kind of information as a society we expect to be held and released. So are we looking at that aspect now? And should that be within the FOI Act, or should that be somewhere else?
Well, that certainly has been the case. There has been, there now are other European obligations and legislation in terms of what constitutes information. So, for example, you know, you're now expected to get access to raw data to allow you to create your own apps and to analyse it. So it's not just what the authority has done with the raw data that you get access to, but the actual raw data itself, and to get that in a usable form, which was not previously necessarily the case under FOI. So yes, I think the nature of what constitutes information has changed markedly since legislation, which is basically based upon a 1960s view of the world as to what we have currently. And the problem, therefore, we now have, and I've heard Liz Denham, the UK Information Commissioner in her previous capacity as the British Columbia Information Commissioner, saying at that time that we've got a problem where we have more information than we've ever had before and the capacity to store it. But less capacity to recover it than ever before, because we simply don't know what we've got and how to get it back. And that really is a problem for all of us.
Alistair Sloan.
Thank you, Convener. Just to pick up on an issue I think I put in my written submission to the committee on this point around keeping records. There's been some discussion this morning about whether that should be on the face of the FOI legislation. I would suggest not, because you are going to be in a situation where that's going to be quite detailed and technical, as some of the discussions this morning have already alluded to. What precisely is the bounds of that is a conversation between two individuals about a project while they're in the staff canteen making a cup of coffee. Is that a meeting that should be documented or not? If there's just a general duty to document, you're probably going to end up with litigation over precisely what that means. You're probably going to have to define it fairly technically in a piece of legislation, and that might make the FOI Act itself unwieldy and something that you probably want to avoid.
Okay. Willie Coffey, do you have any further?
Thank you for that, unless anybody else had a view. So, thank you.
Can I just say on this point, so we've covered theme 3, proactive publication and record keeping. Before I move on to something else, is there anything anyone wants to add that we've not heard on proactive publication and record keeping? Okay, thank you. Can I introduce a topic that I think is of concern to the committee, certainly a few of our members. It's our other duty on this committee is the Audit Committee, and it's our duty to follow the public pound. And we find when we're trying to do that, that there are several private companies that deliver public services that fall out with the gambit of FOI. It's very difficult for, and we heard, I think you've probably read the evidence from our last session, Unison made quite a compelling case that they find it difficult to get information from these services that deliver, these companies that deliver services but are relying on the public pound to do so. Can you tell us if you think a lot of these companies that are building our hospitals and delivering services should be within the gambit of FOI? Who would like to? Professor Dunyan, and then Colin Reid.
I'm happy to let Colin start.
Well, I was just going to make the general observation. This is another function of the date of the whole process, in the same way as our vision of information went back to the 60s, 70s, 80s, our vision of the state, the public sector and the private sector, again goes back to that period where there was a very strict divide. What we've seen in the last 40 years is a huge merging between the two, all sorts of arrangements, partnerships, contracting, franchising, all sorts of things, and it creates a huge problem. There isn't anymore a sharp divide between public and private, and in all sorts of areas it's causing problem. I would say that yes, certainly the sticking it to traditional public authorities, which and constitutionally are public authorities, reflects a narrowing of the scope, and it should be extended wider.
And it should be extended.
I think yes, I think where there are then difficulties about where you draw the limit, both within the authority, within the private company, what bits of its activities, and then what functions trigger it falling within the regime, and that's a hugely complicated area because of the complexity of the arrangements governments keep coming up with to fix things.
Okay, anyone else? Professor Dunyan.
Yeah, I think it's the thing that people feel most strongly about is that since the Act came into effect, people have actually lost rights, and one of the reasons why RSLs, there's been such a push to get RSLs within the scope of designation is that people register social landlords. So people who were once council house tenants find themselves within the scope of a housing association and automatically lost rights to information that they could have got under the Act when they were a council tenant and don't have as a housing association tenant. And of course the concern was, well, this is going to affect very small housing associations, can they cope? But we were marched up and down the hill quite a lot before we got to the stage now where we know that by this year we're going to have registered social landlords within the scope of the legislation. I do feel strongly we should be following the public pound for the purposes of efficiency, for the purposes of economy, partly to do with issues to do with public borrowing. A lot of what was once done at the hand of the public authority directly is now done on their behalf by others and done over a long period of time and for vast sums of public money. And I think that should be directly within the scope of the legislation. My view that if you're looking at anything done which is a public function, a statutory function of an authority, anything done with public funds, proportionately in terms of social, in terms of the scale of the contract perhaps, and thirdly in terms of what is the public interest in it, should be within the scope of the law. So we're talking about things like obviously healthcare, care homes, we're talking certainly about schools, and we really had made incredibly heavy weather of this because this was all thought of before that came into effect. We simply haven't used the provisions there in the nimble way that we expected, and I think we have to get this done now because we're never going to keep pace with the awarding of these contracts if it takes 5, 6, 10 years to then designate the body which receives them.
Much. Dr. Worthy.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something about the difficulties of doing this because I think that there's a broad view, and it's supported by the public, that the Freedom of Information Act should be extended. Polling shows it's a popular move. The difficulty is that lots of politicians, particularly across the UK and elsewhere, have promised to do this. But the thing is that it takes, firstly, a great deal of time, and secondly, it requires quite a bit of kind of political capital and will. And I think it will happen when there's a big enough reason that has enough kind of outcomes. Otherwise, it's quite a difficult process. Just to point to one rather wonderful example, though, when David Cameron was Prime Minister, the UK Act extended to cover Network Rail, seemingly because its designation was changed for another reason. So sometimes it can happen.
But Dr. Worthy, would Carillion not be a big and good enough example?
To be honest, I thought it was. I thought it's that sort of event that will really change the conversation around this. And I think, as with lots of things, it's about somebody taking that point up at the right point.
Ask you, do any other countries extend the freedom of information to private companies? Kevin Dunyan and Karen McCulloch are both nodding. Karen McCulloch?
Some examples in my evidence. I think I listed Mexico and Ireland, and I brought along the legislative text from Ireland. I'm happy to give a copy of it in. And in Ireland, they actually had an interesting experience where they decided to have the option to prescribe or designate, but the word they used was prescribe certain bodies. So they were private sector, but they were being funded by the government. They were providing what were traditionally state services. And one body actually thought mistakenly that they were a prescribed body. And so they went about setting up a Freedom of Information portal on their website and giving very good information. And then the Irish Information Commissioner said, that's great, but you're not actually a prescribed body. So it shows that it's not as challenging as it's sometimes said to be. Actually, it's all about mindset, about culture, and about just grasping the nettle and getting on with it.
Okay.
Delay is the problem.
We're running short of time, so unless it's a new point on that, Professor Dunyan.
Just to answer your question, yes, many countries have provisions in their legislation directly to say that it would cover organisations which provide public services or expend public funds, and that could include charities, of course. So India is an example, Croatia is another example, the country I worked in, Brazil, another country I worked in, where the legislation covers that. It's actually part of nearly all modern FOI laws that this kind of provision is in there. As Ben says, then the test is to actually make it happen, but in both Serbia and Croatia, the Information Commissioners gathered, therefore, and publishes the names of the bodies which are covered by the law using that element of their primary legislation.
I think you're leading us nicely to conclusion there. Can I ask members, before I draw this to a close, if they have any further points they want to raise with the panel? Colin's hand was first, so Colin, then Alex.
There's one area which I don't think we've actually touched on, and it's actually the definition of vexatious requests that's used in the Act. Is the term vexatious clear? Does it need better interpretation? Is it being interpreted properly at the moment? Perhaps you have some view.
Yes, on that point, I think the legislation as it is adequate in that. I think some of the difficulty is in public authorities are not using the vexatious provisions as often or as appropriate. And I think that's a view that was shared by the current Commissioner when he gave evidence to this committee earlier on this year. There is case law defining what that means, both in the UK. The Scottish one was only last year a case of Beggs against the Scottish Information Commissioner, which basically adopts the English or the UK case law in that regard. It's there, it's to be used. I don't think public authorities are necessarily using it as often as they could be. So I wouldn't suggest changing the legislation at this time.
Term vexatious and compare it to the provision under EIR for manifestly unreasonable. Do they equate?
I think in practice they do. I think that because you're talking about the request and its impact rather than the requester, so we're talking about a vexatious request or a manifestly unreasonable request. So as a commissioner, you've got to say, well, what do we mean by this? And it's taken to be the impact. So I think when the first I upheld was actually against a firm of solicitors who submitted several hundred requests to the Scottish Government regarding the tendering for a ferry, knowing that that would simply overwhelm the capacity of the authority, and were unwilling to work with the authority to reduce the scope of that request. I regarded that as being manifestly unreasonable. They knew it to be so, and partly the intent was to actually affect the authority's capacity in that respect. What I would say is that I think authorities have been remarkably restrained and hardly ever use vexatiousness as a reason to refuse information. I think they do shy away from doing that. Now, it may be that they should use it more often to deal with the concerns that they've raised, but they don't choose to use it. But I think manifestly unreasonable, as in the EIRs, as you say, is the test that you would apply in practice.
It's okay if you've got a question. Okay, Alex Neil.
Okay, I'm just going back to a previous answer given by Kevin in relation to the use and getting chasing the public pound, particularly in the private sector. You seem to hint that the provisions are already in statute and are not being used. Was that a correct interpretation of what you said, Kevin?
Yes, I think both in terms of either directly designating or bringing them within the scope of the legislation on an ad hoc basis for certain purposes, that is there. It's not very nimble. It seems to require lots of consultation and then get the responses, go through committee, come up with a designation order and then an implementation period. Now, if your contract is only for 3 years, the 3 years may have expired. You may have expended several millions of public pounds on a failed project in that period, and you still haven't had to answer a single question whilst the contract was actually live. So I think we need to actually find a way of almost building that into the contract process to say that if you are the recipient of this project, you will be subject to FOI laws. And that's, I think that's the kind of practical approach we have to find a way of actually making work rather than the process we have currently. I think there are myriad examples in Scotland where, going back to the concerns we had over Reliance when it had its contract and prisoner escapes and so on, to what's happening in the public-private partnership projects, they would expect to get information directly from the builder or the operator rather than from the authority which lets the contract, which may not hold the information.
Members of the panel have any further points they'd like to make before we close? Any further points or solutions to this? I take it you all sorry, that's maybe a presumption. Do you all think that the Act needs updated? You all do. Okay, well that's very clear. Can I thank you very much indeed for your evidence this morning. I now suspend until 10:20 for a changeover of witnesses. Item 3 is our Section 23 report on finances of Scottish universities. I'd like to welcome our witnesses to the committee this morning: Caroline Gardner, Auditor General for Scotland; Anthony Clark, Audit Director; Mark McPherson, Senior Manager; and Adam Bullock, Audit Manager from Audit Scotland. I'd like to invite the Auditor General to make an opening statement.
Thank you, Convener. Scotland's university sector is highly respected and makes a vital contribution to the economy and wider society, primarily through the important education and research it delivers. The sector in Scotland is diverse. Our analysis of university finances finds that the sector overall is in good financial health, but that masks some significant variation. Scottish Government funding to the sector reduced by 7% in real terms between 2014-15 and 2017-18. Despite this, overall sector income increased by 3% over the same period. Tuition fees represented the single largest source of income for the sector in 2017-18, overtaking Scottish Funding Council grants for the first time. The sector faces a number of financial pressures and uncertainties, including increases in pension contribution rates, significant estate maintenance requirements, and of course EU withdrawal, which is likely to have significant implications for students, staff and funding. While the ancient universities are generally better placed to respond to these financial pressures because of their ability to generate surpluses and the level of reserves they hold, they do face very strong competition from other universities in the UK and the rest of the world. Universities are adopting a range of responses to financial pressures, and most are forecasting increases in fee income, mainly from international non-EU students. The Scottish Funding Council, as the body providing the bulk of the university's public sector funding, has a good understanding of the risks facing the sector. Outcome agreements are a key accountability mechanism between the SFC and universities, setting out what universities plan to deliver in return for SFC funding. But in 2017-18, many universities did not have agreed targets for some measures relating to teaching and research, and in some cases, as few as 2 universities met their targets. This makes it difficult to determine whether universities are contributing as intended to the government's national outcomes. There is also room for improvement in its public reporting of university finances and of university performance against outcome agreement measures. The Funding Council's recently published strategic framework provides a good foundation for future engagement and delivery, and the Funding Council now needs to develop specific proposals to ensure the sector can maintain and enhance its position and the contribution it makes to Scotland. As ever, Convener, my colleagues and I will do our best to answer the committee's questions.
Thank you very much, Auditor General. I'm going to ask Anas Sarwar to open questioning for the committee.
Good morning, Auditor General. Auditor General, in every report that we've had, in every evidence session we've had from yourself, we've almost always discussed workforce challenges and also skills challenges. And obviously Scotland's universities are a key part of addressing those workforce and skills challenges. Do you think the funding model as it currently exists is meeting that challenge?
The funding model I would expect to be one part of meeting that challenge. So would obviously the outcome agreements approach that I've touched on in my introduction and which we cover in the report. It's fair to say that the outcome agreements that we looked at weren't fully effective in agreeing between the university sector, and it's made up of autonomous institutions which receive significant public funding, and the Funding Council which provides that funding, for what they should be delivering and how their contribution would be measured. And in particular, we found that not all universities had targets in place for teaching and research, and that not all of those measures were being achieved in practice. So there is more that can be done, for sure.
One of the things, taking one example, the National Health Service, one of the things we've discussed before at this committee has been the challenge of the balance between Scottish students and international students, and how likely each are to then stay and contribute long-term to Scotland's economy and Scotland's public services. Looking at the stats, although you rightly say that the tuition fees has now taken over the SFC grants, if you actually look at purely the teaching elements, only 18% of the total funding that goes to universities comes from SFC grants. By comparison, 32% comes from tuition fees. So twice as much coming from tuition fees in terms of teaching rather than from SFC grants. and 16% coming from non-EU students. So the international students element is almost identical to the Scottish student element if you look at purely the SFC funding. Surely that's inconsistent with that model of trying to have more Scottish places in universities?
I think we probably need to get to clarify the figures first of all. If I can direct the committee's attention to Exhibit 2, that shows the income profile for the university sector as a whole in 17-18. Of that, you're right, 32% comes from tuition fees, 30% comes from Scottish Funding Council grants, and then 21% from research grants. We haven't covered the funding of Scottish domicile students in detail in this report, although we did in our report back in 2015-16, and I'll ask Anthony to talk you through what we knew then and what we know now.
Sure. Sorry, so you're right about the SFC grants, 30%, but of that SFC grants, over a half, 18.3% of the total budget is for teaching, but there's also within that SFC grants money for research, money for capital, money for strategic, money for FE courses. So off that, I'm referring to the teaching element of the SFC grant rather than the whole SFC grant and complete, and how that teaching grant compares to the teaching money that comes in from tuition fees.
Okay, you're right, it's 18.3% teaching grants and then 7% Scottish students' tuition fees in the sector above. As the committee knows, the way that Scottish students are funded is not through them paying tuition fees themselves, as for students from the rest of the UK and the rest of the world outside Europe, but instead that funding coming in directly through the Student Awards Agency for Scotland. As a consequence of that, the amount that's available is capped because of the very direct call on Scottish Government funding. And we've looked at this in the past and found that although the amount of money available and the number of places has increased, it hasn't increased as rapidly as the number of applications from Scottish students. So that's where the tie comes in there. I think Anthony can give you a bit more information about it.
I'll certainly do my best, Auditor General. And the committee will remember that the Scottish Funding Council funds a set number of places at Scottish universities for Scottish and EU students each year, and it's determined largely by the level of funding that the SFC gets from the Scottish Government. So for the period of time covered by this report, the total number of places for Scottish and EU students increased from just under 125,000 places in 2014-15 to 127,445 places in 2017-18. So over that period, the total number of Scottish enrolments increased by 10%, and the total number of EU enrolments reduced by 2%. So that there hasn't been, if you like, a reduction in Scottish student enrolments over that period. But there has been if that answers your question, Mr. Stanwell.
But is it fair to say that a university is more likely to get greater income from a non-EU student or non-Scottish and non-EU student? So more likely to get more income from an international student or a student from England, and therefore there is at least the risk that they are more likely to enrol a foreign student or an English student into a position rather than a Scottish one, given the funding pressures.
What we can say, I think, is that there is no limit placed on the number of students that universities can enrol from the rest of the UK or outside the European Union. So they're free to enrol and seek to recruit as many students as they can from those places. And it's quite a competitive market. And obviously the fees that they can charge from the students differ as opposed to EU and Scottish students.
Thank you.
On this point?
On this point.
Liam Kerr.
Just for my benefit, I think this is a really important point that Anas is bringing up. If I could just put this in language I understand, if I may. We expect our universities to provide our future workforce, and this committee's looked at NHS workforce planning, it's looked at our education sector workforce plan. If there is a heavier exposure to international students, English students and non-EU students, for funding, we know from previous sessions that they're more likely to return to their home country following completion of this. So in the long term, we are not going to solve our workforce issues on the current funding model. Is that a fair summary?
I'll start off and I'll ask Anthony to come in. I think that it's important to recognise, first of all, that there is variation between universities, and some universities in Scotland have many more students from outside Scotland, relatively speaking, than others. And I wouldn't want us to be thinking about the universities as the only part of the system which is developing the workforce and skills that Scotland needs for the future. Obviously, the further education sector, which this committee has also looked at, plays an important part there. So do schools. And I think there is room for more connection between the different parts of the system to make sure that students who don't go to university straight after school can either return later or can progress through further education colleges into universities. So a joined up approach is really important. But I think Anthony can give you a bit more information on the specifics of your question.
Mr. Chair, one of the aspects of the way in which the system operates is the Scottish Funding Council funds a certain number of what they call controlled places, and these are for specific skill sets like nursing, education and medical places, and those places are funded based on planning that they do at national level with other bits of government. So in a sense, the planning operates through the Scottish Government and the Scottish Funding Council working together to identify how many nurses, midwives, teachers, doctors and so on that they need, and then putting in place a number of places upstream, if you like, through universities to plan for the future needs. So there should be, if you like, no competition from non-EU students or students from the rest of the UK for the places that the Scottish Government needs, I understand. This may be an issue you want to follow up in more detail with the Scottish Funding Council, but there are national arrangements in place to link strategic planning for key skill areas and key professions with university place planning.
Okay, I think Mark McPherson has something further on this point. No? Okay, and Anas Sarwar.
Supplementary to that, you said earlier on, Mr. Clark, that there is no cap on places, or looking at the other way around, no reserved places, so to speak, for Scottish students. Do you think there should be a certain number of reserved places?
I don't think I said that, Mr. Sarwar. I was trying to explain that there are a certain number of places for Scottish and EU students that are agreed each year with individual institutions. I was making the point that there is no limit on places for students from outside the EU, and that's a very competitive market.
Just on that point, let's take the example of medical students. And there is a figure agreed between the sector and the government and the Funding Council about the number of medical students going into medical college. But is it not the case there are far more every year, far more applicants for places who have the necessary qualifications to get into medical school but are not getting into a medical school in Scotland because we don't have enough places for them? I'm talking about Scottish students resident in Scotland.
I don't think we can answer that question absolutely directly based on the report we've got here today. We looked at that issue previously when we were looking at the NHS workforce planning reports, and I think we provided some information to the committee at that stage. I'll check with the team in a moment if any of us have got that at our fingertips, but I don't want to mislead the committee. It is certainly true, though, that, as Anthony has said, the amount of funding that's available to fund the tuition fees for Scottish students and EU students, rest of EU students, does provide an effective cap on the number of those students who can be recruited. That's agreed annually between the Funding Council and individual institutions. And although the number has been increasing in recent years, it hasn't been increasing as fast as the number of applications.
Total cost at the moment for the latest figures of providing tuition fee, giving free tuition to EU students?
I think it's about £97 million. 97
million,
yeah.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
It's been a good discussion, but we've strayed a little bit from the content of the report. Colin Beattie, you have been very patient.
Thank you, Convener. Obviously, looking at the report, one item that really springs out is, not unusually, the backlog of maintenance. And if I'm looking at Exhibit 5, I might just ask for clarification on the Glasgow School of Art figure. Does that 39.2% include the repairs to the fire damage, which would obviously distort that?
Yes, I believe it does, yes.
It does?
Yeah.
Do we know what the figure would be without that?
Don't know if we've got that level.
Because clearly there's a different funding exercise going on to rectify that, so that would distort this figure considerably. I'll move on just for the moment. But, I mean, paragraph 41 clearly says that £139 million is needed to address urgent backlog. Now, what is happening between the universities, the Scottish Government or the SFC looking at how to address that urgent backlog? I mean, obviously, the total backlog is 937 million, but the urgent backlog is obviously what we want to focus on at the moment.
I think similar to you've heard around colleges, the current amount of Scottish Government funding to support the capital investment is not sufficient to cover that. But again, universities are obviously independent, autonomous commercial entities, and it's very much a responsibility of them to be careful about how they manage their estate maintenance costs.
While that's true, you would expect the Scottish Government stroke SFC to take an interest in this, because the health of the universities is obviously a key issue.
Certainly regular engagement between those three entities.
So there is ongoing discussion on this point?
Yeah. As there is around all of the kind of financial issues and pressures affecting the university sector.
I mean, it's highlighted in your report that the universities are operating in a highly competitive environment. Therefore, the quality of the accommodation, of the facilities, is critical to being able to sell the university. And we're talking about, you know, competing to get international students in. And in that respect, we're not just competing within Scotland or the UK, we're competing internationally. And, you know, you would hope that your universities are providing state-of-the-art facilities to attract these students in. Are they?
You're absolutely right about the importance of it. It's key that universities need to be able to not just maintain the estate they've currently got, but also to keep upgrading it to reflect the development in scientific research, for example, new ways of teaching with the use of IT for recording lectures and making them available to people off campus. Their ability to make those investments, I think, varies across the 18 universities in Scotland in the ways that we've described here. It's one of the reasons why I think it's so important for the Funding Council to have that view of the longer-term financial sustainability of universities and to be thinking how it uses its own funding and the other levers it's got, like outcome agreements, to mitigate those risks across the sector as a whole.
As part of the audit exercise here, were there discussions held with the individual universities on how they're going to handle their backlog?
No, I think it's important to remind the committee that I don't appoint the auditors to individual universities in the way I do to all of the other bodies in my remit. The focus here is on the sector as a whole and on what government and the Funding Council are doing to understand the sector and to manage the contribution that universities make to the Scottish Government's priorities in return for the significant public funding they receive. So we haven't talked in detail to the individual universities. Instead, we've used their published financial accounts and financial plans to produce the analysis here.
Just a slightly different angle on this. I was astonished to see how many buildings the universities actually own. Obviously, it covers a vast array of and types of facility. And I think you highlighted this yourself, but are you aware that any of the universities are actually looking at selling or disposing of part of their estates in order to, well, frankly, fund their operations?
Well,
estate rationalisation is certainly something that universities will consider, but that should be done obviously as part of a broader estate management strategy. We did hear of one example in Aberdeen where an old building that is currently listed but is no longer in operational use due to the needs that no longer being fit for the purpose for the university needs, but has difficulty selling it for similar reasons. It is working with the local authorities and others in the area to see if it can find an appropriate use for it, but we don't know how widespread that kind of non-operational use is within the sector.
Obviously, it's a concern in relation to the financial health of these bodies if they're being forced to sell off parts of the estate in order to fund their day-to-day operations in particular.
I've said clearly in the report that any decisions around estate rationalisation or no further use of the estate or selling of the estate should be taken as part of a broader strategy.
But from the point of view of the audit, and I recognise what you say, Auditor General, but as part of the audit, you would pick up if they were in fact disposing of assets in this way?
We wouldn't have a direct way of doing that other than for very significant disposals that were reflected in the accounts as exceptional items. We haven't looked at the 18 universities. We've looked at the financial analysis and at what the Funding Council does to understand and mitigate the risks that they're facing.
Just one last question. In the report, you highlighted the fact that the ancient universities tend to be in a better situation in terms of meeting the challenges that are coming up than some of the others. Although I do look again in Exhibit 5, University of Aberdeen receives, compared to the other ancient universities, a higher proportion of SFC funding, higher staff costs as a percentage of expenditure, and a very much higher urgent backlog maintenance as a percentage of income. And you've touched on the fact they're looking to dispose of one building. Is that one building comprising a good chunk of that urgent backlog maintenance?
It certainly forms a large chunk of its overall backlog maintenance figure. I'm not sure we have the detail to say how much of the urgent backlog maintenance.
It would have been interesting to see how valid that was in terms of the current buildings that are in use, because 20.8% of their income being allocated to that would be a real drain on them.
And there's no question that Aberdeen is less well placed than the other three ancient universities to respond to the challenges that we're seeing here. I don't think we've got the figures to break down in the way that you've described because of the sector-wide focus that we've got. But you're absolutely right, Aberdeen is facing significant challenges and its estate is part of that.
Thanks very much, Convener. Auditor General, I wonder if I could draw your attention to Exhibit 6 in your report. It's about the potential impact of EU withdrawal on the universities. Your exhibit shows us clearly there that there are over 8,000 staff at our universities from the European Union. There are over 21,000 students, and I don't think that includes the Erasmus students and visitors, but you could clarify that. And there's, in terms of research funding that our universities receive, it's about £114 million. Have you been able to, or have the universities been able to assess the possible impact of losing any proportion of students, staff, or the research funding, and what does that look like at the moment?
Your colleagues on the Education and Skills Committee held a special session quite recently looking at the impact of EU withdrawal or the potential impact on Scotland's universities. I think it's fair to say that the participants in that, the University of Scotland, the National Union of Students and the University and College Union, Lecturers Union, University and College Lecturers Union representatives were all very concerned and provided some more analysis at a more detailed level than the figures we've got here. I think one of the challenges is that nobody is clear yet what government response will be at either Scottish Government or UK Government level to the changes that may happen. And therefore it's very difficult for universities to plan how they might replace the funding that's at risk, how much of that they would actually lose, and what the impact on staff and students might be. We have seen, I think, very recently a dip in the number of applications of EU students to Scottish universities over the last year. The information on staff is less readily available, so it's hard to know what impact it's having either on people's decisions to move here or on existing EU staff who may decide to move on somewhere else because of the uncertainty that's available. But there's no doubt it's potentially very significant.
Know what the size of the dip in application from the students is? What kind of size that is?
I have the figure with us from the submissions made to the Education Committee. I don't have it at my fingertips, but we may be able to come back to it during this session if that would be helpful.
And on that research, there's a footnote to your comment about the research funding there. I think it says just below the table that at least half of the £114 million EU research funding would be protected. I think that's a statement by the UK government, but by implication that means that half of it isn't. What do we mean by that protected? What does it mean? Is it certain sectors or certain types of research? Or
I don't know the detail of it, just that the UK government has given assurance that there will be a degree of protection for some of the existing programmes that are currently funded through the EU research funding.
Roughly half of that? So
that's what the estimate, yes, the Scottish Government estimates half will be available.
Okay, clearly. I think our other committee will be looking at this in more detail, I think, convener, by the sounds of it. But I would appreciate any further figures you have, and whether the Erasmus students are or not in that student tally there. That would be interesting to know that as well.
That point, as note 2 to the exhibit points out, that excludes the visiting and exchange students.
And that's Erasmus, isn't it?
Yeah.
Do we have the numbers of them?
I don't have it to hand.
Okay,
but again,
maybe catch up with you. Thank you for that. Thank you.
Supplementary on this point, and ask Sarwar.
And that obviously that's a huge concern. Losing the EU funding, around half of the 114 million would be a significant amount coming out of our university sector. Can I just pick up on Exhibit 2, where it's 21% of the 3.8 billion of money that comes into Scottish universities comes from research grants. Of that, 2.6% comes from the EU, which is where that 114 million figure comes from. Just to note on that same figure, 3.5% comes from the UK government, 4.3% comes from UK charities, 7.4% comes from the UK Research Council. So that's a total of 15.2% out of the 21%. So 2/3 of the research money comes from UK authorities. I think it's safe to say any challenge to that section of our research grant would have a devastating impact on our research budgets in Scottish universities.
You'll understand that we need to be focusing on analysing the information that's here as we present it. You're correct in your analysis of the sources of the research funding that's shown in Exhibit 2 at the top half. It's also true, as we show in the bottom half of that exhibit, that individual universities rely to very different extents on research funding and indeed the other sources. So as with all of this, the impact on individual universities will be quite different, but they are working in a context of cost pressures and a great deal of uncertainty, which makes it difficult for them to plan for the future. And that's why I think the Funding Council needs to be working with them to understand the pressures that they face and how they can be mitigated.
Thank you, Roger. And so just to confirm that just over 1/3 of the research grant money that comes in comes from the EU government, and 2/3 of the research money comes in from UK funding sources.
To add up in our heads at the moment, we've got it looks to me that around 2/3 of the research grants come from UK sources, not all from the UK government.
Excellent. Thank you.
Alex Neil.
I don't have any questions, just to comment to say
I've
we've
got
just get some of our own money back from
I
the
have
EU.
you on my list. Okay. Liam Kerr then.
No, I don't have a
Okay,
question.
sorry, Bill Bowman.
And fill the gap. Just a couple of questions on the actual the numbers and the report itself. In paragraph 13, you say, on page, I think, 8, all financial data is reported in real terms adjusted using gross domestic product deflators at market prices. So which of the numbers in here are what I would call real numbers, and which are sort of funny numbers that you take by getting the real numbers and applying a coefficient to them?
The team will keep me straight, but I think the figures we've reported for the 2017-18 year are nominal terms, and we've then used deflators to get changes over a period of time. So the change in government funding from 14-15 has been deflated in that way.
These are numbers that you wouldn't get from just taking the accounts in each of the individual years. You've applied some adjustment to them. So I think that's something we need to be
for years prior than 17-18.
In your very first point, you say, while the aggregated underlying financial position shows the sector overall to be in good financial health, it masks significant variation. I think that's something we need to be quite careful about, because if you take Exhibit 1, for example, again on page 11 maybe, you show lines going one way and lines going the other way, but there's no way you can take, let's say, Scotland Rural College surplus and just say, well, we'll apply that to Glasgow Caledonian University's deficit. So what value does actually aggregating it give you, in that if people are doing well, then that's fine. If they're not, then you need to look at the individual ones. You can't just add it all together and say overall everything's fine.
We've tried to provide both the Scotland-wide picture and the disaggregation wherever that's possible. So you'll see in Exhibit 2 as well, we've given the overall makeup of income for the sector at the top of the graph and then broken it down by institution beneath that. And I think, again, that reflects the fact that my interest in this sector is at the sector level, not the individual institution. But if we just look at the sector as a whole, we lose a lot of the detail, which is very important for understanding actually what are the pressures and the risks for the future.
I think Exhibit 2 is what you might call a busy slide. But just looking at, back to Exhibit 1, is there a way, are these are all independent organisations or enterprises, these bodies? There is no way you can just tell one to take the funds here and move it somewhere else. It would have to be by government deciding on, we will mitigate this loss by reducing the funding there and increasing it there.
As Auditor General, I can't tell any public body what to do with its funding, and I report to this committee on what the position is. And I think it is important for us to be clear that universities are autonomous institutions, some of them very old ones with long histories. They also receive significant amounts of public money, more than £1 billion directly in SFC funding, plus tuition fees for Scottish and EU students. I think the overall recommendation we're making here is that the Scottish Funding Council needs to be clear about the risks and the opportunities that are facing individual institutions, and make sure that the way it applies its funding and the other levers that it has, like the outcome agreements, is helping both to mitigate those risks and to make sure that the contribution to Scotland's priorities, or the Scottish Government's priorities, is being achieved in return for that funding.
I don't wish to be awkward in the numbers. It's just that when you do what I would have called inflation accounting, you're not necessarily comparing apples and apples. You have to realise that the figures, when we talk about changes from year to year, they are derived figures and they give a trend, but they're not the exact figures you can pick out of the accounts.
That's true, but equally, if we didn't adjust them for inflation, it would look as though the funding position was more favourable than it is in practice, given the pressures that come through inflation.
Thank you.
Liam Kerr.
Thank you, Convener. Just on the sector focus that you talked about, and you talked there briefly about the Scottish Government's priorities. So I just have a general question, because as I understand it, the Scottish Government issues various directives or outcomes that it expects the sector to achieve, and we talked about the workforce of the future, for example, earlier on. But what I also get from the report is that real terms funding from the Scottish Government is reducing, and they seem to be expecting more to be generated from private sources, from the research funding perhaps, or from non-EU students perhaps, in a context where they're asking for more and more to be done and achieved by the sector. And I'm just wondering how that can be squared off in the medium to longer term.
I think it's important for me to say, first of all, that we recognise that the Scottish Government's budget is under pressure and has been for a period of time, and in a context where the Government's made a commitment to protect the health service budget in real terms, other funding streams, other parts of the budget will come under pressure. That's simply a reality. The Funding Council funding to universities is significant, but it isn't the largest part of what they raise overall because of the trends that we've seen over recent years. And as we said, they are autonomous institutions that would in any case be raising income from a range of different sources, which we've tried to set out in the report. Having said all of that, I think it is important that there's a clearer line of sight between what the government and the Funding Council want universities to contribute to their priorities for Scotland, and the public funding that they receive, which is well over £1 billion a year. And we make some recommendations in the report for the way in which the outcome agreements are put together, and for the action that the Funding Council takes when targets are not met, to make that line of sight, that accountability for public funding, clearer than it currently is.
Thank you.
Do members have any further questions for the panel?
Can I just ask one?
Alex Neil.
And I know this is not a question that's been asked in this report, but some of the issues thrown up by the report, I think, poses the question, do we have too many universities in Scotland?
That's not a question for me. As the committee knows, I'm precluded from commenting on matters of policy. What we have shown in here, though, is that all the universities are facing a number of cost pressures and that they're operating in a very competitive environment, not just in Scotland, but UK-wide and globally. And I think that's a question which the committee may want to pose to the Scottish Funding Council as it thinks about the risks facing the sector and the individual universities that make it up.
Cost overhead of each of the 19 institutions and wonder, I mean, the Enterprise Committee, when I chaired it, looked at this a number of years ago, and certainly there was a lot of consensus around a closer relationship, say, between universities and colleges, and some people from the university sector argued that, you know, instead of having so many individual institutions, and we've got more now than we had then, that it would be much better for everybody if we had fewer institutions and, you know, a lot of the cost perhaps could then go into the front line rather than into administrative overhead. Is that something that you think needs to be looked at?
I completely understand why you would ask the question, and you look at what we say in this report about the pressures on individual universities, what we said about the pressures on colleges in our college annual report. I think it's an appropriate question to ask. What I'm saying is that I'm precluded by legislation from answering it because it's a matter of policy.
It's a pity.
Thank you very much indeed for your evidence this morning. I'll now close the public session as we move into private.